So it's my honor to introduce, it's interesting to me that someone who has worked on not only the PlayStation Store, PS3, PS4, Microsoft Xbox, Xbox Live, Xbox 360, but even helped develop the Nintendo GameCube. I love that. He is now the Chief Technology Officer for Hulu. If you would please welcome Tian Lim.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Thank you so much, Jose, for that very warm welcome. I would thank Dan as well for inviting us. It's so sad that he couldn't be here today. And thank you all for coming up this early in the morning. I mean, I don't know about you guys, for me, it is literally 6 a.m. So I'm going to be telling you a story of a small band of young hopefuls out to redefine television and rebuild their technology stack at the same time. I'm not going to claim that we did everything exactly right or the best way, but I do hope to give you an entertaining look at what we tried to accomplish, what it takes to develop a DMVPD in today's world under the constraints that we had, and what we think will foster more innovation in the future based on the headwinds that we encountered. So obviously, we're not the first to attempt to bring live TV and its 40 years of broadcast legacy kicking and screaming into the internet age. We are talking about a very old industry that is set in its ways. There's an intricate ecosystem that isn't quite ready to be transplanted into the internet. As if that wasn't hard enough, we also upped the ante in a couple of ways, which I'll talk about in a bit. Basically, weaving live and an existing SVOD service together turns out to be trickier than you'd think. And of course, we set out to redefine the television experience. So I will quickly introduce Hulu, get right into the details, or some of the details of our live service. And based on that, what are the things that we think are critical to accelerate innovation in this space? So first, who is this guy? Unfortunately, Jose already told you who I am and what I've done. I've been very lucky to have a very entertaining career. What I've done here is just quickly filter down some of the things that are video related. You might think, consoles, what does that have to do with video? Well, in the case of the GameCube, one of the things I had to do was develop a codec. This was back when MPEG-2 was really hard to decode. Do you guys remember those days when your PC just couldn't do MPEG-2 without hardware support? Imagine trying to do it on a 400 megahertz chip while you had to run AI and animate characters and all that other stuff. So we built a codec basically from scratch in assembly for the Resident Evil games. At Xbox, I helped build the Xbox 360. I ended up doing a lot of the DVD player. I know far too much about how Dolby and DTS are delivered over SPDIF. If you ever want to know, welcome to talk to me about it. Anyone remember HD DVD? Yeah, this was back when H.264 was hard to decode. Do you remember those days? Imagine that we had to do that, decode a 1080p image, and decode a 640p image at the same time while rendering graphics on top of that on a pretty weak chip. So you might think that, that seems like a pretty big waste of time. But it turns out that everything that we did for the HD DVD project laid the groundwork for streaming video on Xbox in general. We launched the first transactional video on demand service on Xbox 360. You'll see Netflix there. My team built the first version of Netflix that was not on a Roku. Do you remember when Netflix was literally just one list? No other lists. You curated that list. Those good old days. It's literally 10 years ago. We also tried to innovate. We brought social to Netflix. Nobody used it. We did live TV on Sky, and we brought the social there. And there people did use it, because that was where you could consume and share the experience of watching a live soccer game. So that was a big differentiator. And then finally, their Zune video. I don't know if anyone remembers the word Zune. But my boss back then wanted to be able to say instant on 1080p. And basically, this was the beginning of smooth streaming on the Xbox 360. So it was the first time that we brought adaptive bitrate streaming to the console. And then finally, at Sony Network Entertainment, I drove all the services for the bulk of the services for e-commerce and the PlayStation. So let me quickly introduce the company. Let's face it, when you guys are tasked with saying, what's Hulu? You all say, it's Netflix with ads, right? Admit it. Let me give you a slightly more nuanced equation to use. So Hulu, yeah, it's got a bit of Netflix in it, right? With a lot of similarities from a customer perspective. I view Netflix as the big, mature brother in the industry. From an engineering culture perspective, Hulu and Netflix are probably complete polar opposites. We're like the really small, scrappy brother to Netflix. We don't do CDN, and we aren't international. We do have day after TV, which introduces its own business and technical and operational challenges. We do everything that Freewheel does. We have our own ad server. We have our own tool chain for the ad sales lifecycle as well. We also have a slightly more complex offering in general. We have the no commercials plan, we offer Showtime, and we have other premium add-ons forthcoming. We now do a lot of what YouTube TV does, except with more live sports, more devices, and so on and so forth. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't say we didn't have a very grown-up ad sales force. This is what happens when you let the sales guy edit your slides. But we're very proud of our ad sales team. I'm proud of them. They pay my salary. So what makes us unique? We are a media and technology company. Now, you might think, what does that even really mean? The reality is that you need people that understand the media industry and the 40 years of legacy that's been built up in that business. You also need people that understand technology. And of the DMVPDs that have already entered the market, most of them have fallen firmly into one side or the other. DirecTV and Dish, clearly media companies. Google, clearly a tech company. We had a unique opportunity to kind of combine our existing application with the live service. And in general, we are a very natural destination for advertising. We care a lot about the advertising experience. I'll go into that just a little bit more later on. We're actually a very lean team. So if you combine all the engineering resources in Freewheel and Netflix, depending how you count, Hulu probably has 3, 4, 5 times fewer engineers. So this will color some of what happens later on. So we are, the engineering organization is in 4 offices: Seattle, Santa Monica, NorCal, and Beijing. We built everything from scratch. We built the entire stack, pretty much. You see there, teleconferencing service, that is not a typo. If you dial into the Hulu conference line, that was built by the team before I joined. They built everything. So this gives you a sense of like the kind of company we are and the kind of team we have. Note that line at the bottom, right? Prior to delivering this live service, we didn't actually really have 24/7 operations except for content. So this was definitely a new experience for us. So let me dive into the live service. The first thing you might ask is, why did we do this? And there are a lot of reasons that we've put out there in the press, but I want to give you my personal reason. And it's the reason that a lot of my team joined me at Hulu. And that's because we really believe we have an opportunity to redefine television again. It's literally on our website in our mission, vision, and values. This is a screenshot from our website. When I first joined Hulu, one of the first things we did was to try to reset the mission, vision, and values. And my very small contribution to the thing was the term redefine TV. It is definitely the reason I joined. It's why we're here. So for us, this was a huge undertaking. We literally rewrote most of Hulu for this enterprise. No one's getting the visual pun joke. I'm clearly the biggest nerd in the room. Considering the audience here, I'm only going to focus this presentation on the first 3 things, but let me quickly run through this. For us, everything starts with the viewer experience. We wanted to reimagine the TV experience, and that colored how we approached everything, from content negotiations, business deals, UX design, and technical design. We definitely did a few things probably a little unconventionally for signal acquisition. I'll get into that. And spoiler alert, most of this deck actually ends up talking about metadata. Someone from Grace Note, I assume, there. A couple of things that I won't talk about in detail, but just to highlight the additional challenges. there's a ton of MVPD video-on-demand content, and that introduced some different challenges for us. Recommendations, we have a world-class recommendations team in Beijing, but live TV really introduced some new challenges. The schedule is constantly changing, especially with live sports. And so, we have to constantly refresh recommendations at extremely high rate, introducing massive scalability challenges. We're under a lot of contractual obligations, and we had to build out high-scale services for those things. And lastly, but certainly not least, was developing the client applications themselves. We literally rewrote all the Hulu applications for this enterprise. So let me quickly dive into the experience. I'm not going to go into all these things in detail, but I want to preface something that I'm not sure most of you are aware of. Have you ever noticed how most cable TV boxes, their experiences look mostly the same, whether it has a DVR or not? The reason why most of these things look the same is because the user experience has always been slapped on top of the rights. It's always played second fiddle to the rights. We have the notion of DVR recordings, video on demand, things in the electronic programming guide. Each of these things are actually separate grants of rights that have been granted differently over the decades. And basically, the UX is whatever you could do to slap it all together and present it to the user. So we tried to attack that notion from a very viewer-centric perspective. So I'm not going to read all these off. You guys can scan the text, but I want to highlight the minimizing the need for a viewer to understand tech and content rights. This space is really complicated. So there are different rules, reporting requirements, and rights associated with all the different assets. And at any given point in time, you could be watching an old Hulu SVOD asset, a C3 or C7 MVPD VOD asset, a DVR asset, or an asset that has or does not have start over look back rights. It's crazy complicated. And rather than make the viewers understand this space, we try to insulate them as much as possible. Everything on demand. We live in an on-demand world. You shouldn't have to hunt and peck through an electronic programming guide to find the stuff you want to watch. Nor should you have to go navigate an arcane UI to find where the VOD content is. So we worked hard to make everything look on demand, and this introduced some interesting challenges for us. I've already said we wanted to reimagine the TV experience. We love TV, movies, and sports, and I hope it comes through when you browse our UI. But enough talking. Let's take a walk on the wild side and actually try to do a live demo. So a couple of caveats. This is a live demo. I'm on the hotel Wi-Fi. I'm on bleeding edge application bits, literally. Like I got a build this morning. So I have no idea what's on TV today, right this second. So I'll give it a shot. So what I've done is I've created a new profile just for this, just to walk you through the initial experience. And we first want to personalize the experience by looking for some guidance from the user as to what they like. So first, some quick orientation around the UI. The plus button, anytime you see a plus, it adds to my stuff. And this is a catch-all for, this is the way in which I create my own curated experience and how I tell Hulu to A, start recommending more stuff like this to me, and B, start recording more stuff for me. And that's where my stuff is. We don't have a watch list, so let me quickly help prime the recommendations engine. I'm going to try and pick things that I would ordinarily never pick, like popular dramas, documentaries. I actually love British comedy, but I hate celeb. You discover all kinds of strange things in this sort of project, like just how much Kardashians is on Bravo. It's shocking. Then those were broad genres. These are more specific things. So based on those genres, what are some specific shows that you might like? And I assume that because you like celeb reality, you probably do like the Kardashians. I'll just add a few random things here and there. Sports is obviously a huge part of our experience. I ordinarily would pick teams I don't like, but I just can't do that. I've got to pick the Penguins. Sorry to Rangers fans. And then the networks. So I guess since this is being broadcast over the internet, I better pick everything that my owners provide. Am I missing anything? And now, based on that information, we're generating a unique lineup. And I just want to quickly show you this because it is going to look very different than my own profile. Like I said, the hotel Wi-Fi I found a little flaky, so you might see images pop in a little late. But basically, lineup is our recommendations. It's also a combination of some things that we think, in general, we need to promote a bit more and boost. So that's why Handmaid's Tale is the #1 thing. All your sports is consolidated into one pivot here. So you can see anything with a green icon, green lightning bolt, means it's live. So actually NBCSN probably won't work because I'm actually in LA right now. I'll find something later. And then movies also, as you see, it's a combination of live and probably a few things on demand down here. So basically, we try to focus on the kinds of things that the user would like, whether they're live or not, whether they come from VOD or not, whether they're an MVPD VOD or not. I talked about my stuff. This is your personal collection. I'll use my personal account for that later. And one of the magical things that we found was just the act of repivoting the electronic programming guide into more these genres or categories. So for example, in movies, you'll see a list of things that are promoted to you, but also things that are live across every single channel. So right now, I'm surprised there are any movies running at 9 a.m. At all. So that's amazing. But also the upcoming, because basically what this does is it saves you from having to scroll many, many hours into the future on an EPG in order to find a movie that you might be interested in. And basically what we found is you end up discovering all kinds of stuff on channels you never knew even existed. Once you actually start something, I will try FXM. We do have the one notion of an EPG, and that is what we call the flip tray. So this shows you what's live on all the channels. So that's FX, that's FXM, that's NBCSN, A&E, so on and so forth. And then up next shows you basically the programming guide for FXM right this second. So that gives you a sense of what the UI is about. Let me just quickly show you that for my personal profile, things look quite a bit different. There's a lot more anime. I was flipping through channels. That's why paid programming is being promoted to me earlier. But I was watching the Senators game last night, and I am following that series. So it just gives you a flavor of how different the experience can look for different users. Oh, and I'll quickly show you my stuff because mine is a lot more populated. You can see that I've got lots of different shows that I can quickly get caught back up on. My teams are right here. I can go see what's going on with them. I can see what games I have recorded, what's upcoming, and manage my DVR. So that's just a quick whirlwind view of the application so you have a sense of what I'm talking about as I go through. And feel free to play with it later on in the pavilion. OK, so a couple of the other magic moments. I talked about movies, but actually March Madness was a very, very special moment. So as we were in private beta, March Madness was going on. And there are a ton of games spread across 4 very different channels. And if you were trying to monitor different games, it was a real pain. But for us, we just naturally had everything listed in sports and promoted to you anyway. So it was the best place to watch March Madness. Presenting just the right thing at the right time. There's so many little moments where you just log in and you discover, holy crap, I didn't even know that I just missed that. But luckily, it was in my stuff. I DVR'd it. It's promoted to me. I'm 1 click in. That happened so many times during the private beta. And that gave us the confidence that even though we're doing some pretty crazy things like taking away the EPG, that we can replace it with more magical moments like what I just described. I talked briefly about how you might discover new movies and on different channels that you didn't even know existed. Like, for example, I had no idea Freeform had all of Twilight. Not that I would ever watch any of it. But there's just so much good content available only on Live. It can't be streamed anywhere else. For example, we discovered that TBS had the full Star Wars collection, right? Streaming. You can't stream that anywhere. But as a consequence, we saw that and we promoted it to the very top of the UI. So in one place, you could find all 6 of the movies, as well as some of the ancillary content. OK, so let's dive into how all this stuff was built. So what I found is that live stream delivery has really changed over the last 3 to 4 years. The last time I looked at this area, I was at Sony. PlayStation Vue was just getting off the ground. I had a sense of where things were. But now things have changed quite a bit. And I think TV everywhere has really accelerated the change here. What we see now is a lot of multiple vendors providing really good end-to-end turnkey services if you use everything that they provide. They all have a lot of the similar things. But this also creates fragmentation in the industry, because now every content provider has invested in different vendors, especially on the broadcast automation and station integration side. And that creates some pretty interesting problems that we'll talk about. So the typical components in one of these vendor solutions might look like this. And I'm interested in most particularly in the things in the dark rectangle. That's where people have actually invested energy to integrate with stations, integrate with their processes and whatever broadcast automation may or may not be there. So you might install hardware or software to encode the broadcast signal into some kind of contribution or MES feed. There has to be some way to manage metadata, some way to inject triggers, so on and so forth. And then, of course, I've mentioned integration with the existing broadcast automation. I think most of you should be familiar with the things to the right in terms of transcoding and delivering over the internet. But for us, this presented a lot of challenges. So we already have a lot of applications. They're out there, they're deployed. We have our own content management systems. We have our own custom ad server, as I noted earlier. And interestingly enough, at the very last bullet there, we have deviated from canonical metadata sources. What that means is we have changed the way programs and shows are presented to users in pursuit of a better user experience. And this has created some very interesting friction that I'll talk about later on. So what we ended up doing, our high-level architecture, we depended on vendors to acquire the source signal. So anything blue is a vendor. We depended on them to deliver HLS ABR profiles. We then repackaged those with commercial DRM to both HLS and Dash. We pushed to origin. And for each device, we generate HLS or Dash manifests on demand. On the metadata side, we again look to the vendors to help provide SCUDdy 224 or ESNI equivalent. So SCUDdy 224 is the out-of-band metadata that tells you what rights restrictions and so on and so forth apply to each program. And SCUDdy 35 if available, although we kind of really need it. We have other sources of metadata. We do get the look-ahead schedule. We have a massive database of old metadata from our years running the SVOD service. And then, as you noted, there's some editorialization that happens as well as we need tools in order to fix up issues that we see, and there were a lot. And all of this gets combined into the new Hulu metadata database. And that powers the brand new stack that we built out for discovery and playback. So in reality, just to make this diagram slightly more complicated, there were multiple vendors. So we had multiple vendors providing everything in the blue boxes as well. And I will add to that diagram later on. Very quickly, you've noticed that we talked about HLS and Dash. We were already delivering VOD assets over both HLS and Dash. We have been early adopters of Dash, and that has worked very well for us, especially in supporting multiple commercial DRM requirements, as well as using Xlink for DAI. But however, Dash in live is obviously less used and less common. again, because we were able to use common encryption, this saved us a ton on storage and origin, and allowed us to leverage our existing investment. And by that I mean we knew the entire stack end to end. We wrote all the code for it. So we were able to, even though it hasn't had as much time as HLS to bake, we were able to iterate extremely quickly and get it stable for launch. The demo you just saw running in a browser was, all Dash. Now, you notice that we're using HLS contribution feeds, and we took this approach rather than taking in or ingesting a mezzanine quality feed because we just didn't want to get into the encoding business, at least not yet. And the main reason for that, besides not wanting to take on that burden, you saw how small our team is. We also wanted time to market. There are, of course, some natural challenges with trying to use HLS as a contribution format. It was designed to serve clients, not other services. And so we discovered and worked through a lot of those issues as a consequence. The other interesting thing that we did is everything in that red box for live ingest is running in the cloud. So live ingest, repackaging, and the DVR and origin are all in the cloud. We're using S3 to feed both Akamai and CloudFront. And some pretty obvious pros of this. Once it's ingested into the cloud, we don't actually need to let those bits exit the cloud until it gets to gets to the CDNs. It frees us up from having to build out our own data centers and bandwidth. So we already had 2 data centers expanding to 3. We know how long it takes to stand up data centers, get them provisioned, and debug them. And this saved us a lot of pain, especially as the subscribers will ramp. We don't have to worry about bursting into other data centers if needed. Now, this was our first large, high-performance deployment into AWS. So we did learn some pretty interesting things about S3 performance characteristics and the AWS databases. But that agility really, really helped us because we ended up re-architecting almost everything for the database backend for manifest generation. Literally, I think we were done, a week before launch with the re-architecture, and we started that re-architecture about 3 weeks before launch. My favorite part of the conversation, metadata. So I'm going to talk about this area. Anything you can imagine about, imagine going wrong, reconciling data across 10 different disparate data sources will go wrong. Extremely painful process. Just to give you a flavor of some of the problems that we encountered. So you would think, oh, you've got an existing SVOD service. It should be pretty easy to just match it with everything else, right? Not so. So for this, I'm just going to use a very simple example using Battlestar Galactica. Anyone familiar with Battlestar Galactica? Yep. So for those that are uninitiated, Battlestar Galactica started out as a 2-part pilot, and then 4 seasons of science fiction awesome. Maybe one of them jumped the shark. Grace Note puts the pilot into a separate miniseries. IMDb agrees. But when we ingested this for the SVOD service, we're like, that doesn't make any sense for the user. If you jumped into Battlestar Galactica, you'd basically be starting at episode 3. And you'd be like, what happened to the first 2 episodes? And you'd have to know to go to and find the pilot miniseries. So we didn't do that. We made the pilot episodes 1 and 2 of season 1. Guess what happened? All our episodes are off by 2 for that season. This is just one small example of thousands of ways in which we differed from the rest of the universe. Any 2-parter episode was probably handled differently. Anything dealing with anime or multiple languages tended to be handled differently as well. So it just gives you a flavor of some of the challenges that we had. And that was just matching Hulu SVOD to canonical data sources. You can quickly scan that, but basically we needed a decent amount of all the basic entity information you would have expected. But one of the things that we discovered was really, really lacking, and I'll talk more about this, was variations on art. and sports information in general. There are so many sports leagues that are underserved, that have very little metadata, very little connective tissue connecting events to leagues, to championships, and so on and so forth. And then for basic contractual obligations, like being able to support blackouts and device restrictions, we needed a lot of other metadata. So SCSI-35, for those of you not familiar, is what we began calling in-band metadata. That's where you get program starts and ends. You figure out where the ad boundaries are and where your local ad avails would be. And occasionally you get slate triggers in there as well, as in black this out immediately. And then what we call out-of-band metadata, we wanted to get in SCSI-224. SCSI-224 was still a pretty nascent format we discovered. I'll get into that a bit more. But basically there, we wanted to try and get consistent way for people to communicate to us which geos are you allowed to play this program in? If not, what do you replace it with? What devices? So on and so forth. So that out-of-band metadata came in so many forms. So we wanted to conform to 224, but even for the content providers that were using SCSI-224, they were all implementing it very differently. On top of that, the different approaches had varying levels of dependency on how well they implemented SCSI-35. So in some cases, there's a very heavy dependency. So if SCSI-35 ever screws up in any way, the whole thing falls apart. That's only a few people are trying to use SCSI-224. At least 2 of the providers are using custom APIs, which of course require a completely different integration model. And then another provider provides us Excel spreadsheets with arcane color coding. And then updates to that spreadsheet come via email by human with no fixed format whatsoever. So we ended up basically having to spin up 24/7 operations just to ingest and translate Excel spreadsheet into something that we could actually implement. So this basically made alcoholics of my entire content metadata team, if they weren't already. So I've mentioned that we pride ourselves on the advertising experience. We pride ourselves on advertising innovation. In order to innovate in this space, you need to know where the ad pods are supposed to be. And for that, we're supposed to depend on SCSI-35. It is an existing broadcast standard. It works in broadcast. It doesn't seem to work on the internet. So it really felt like we were the first to attempt to use this at scale for internet delivery across many different providers. It simply is not robust enough right now for automation. So let me give you a quick example. So I talked about slating. So one provider follows the spec and says, OK, if I set web delivery allowed flag equals 0, that means slate this program. Makes sense, right? Provider B says, well, actually, if I set it to 1, please slate this program. So literally, half of the channels that we would bring on board would be all slates 24/7. And then, of course, a different provider will give us a different way to establish blackouts. It was absolute chaos. The implementation level is very different across the different providers, and it was just extremely painful to try to begin to normalize. In fact, just last week, I think we just disabled SCSI-35 on some of the channels because it was just too broken. One story that really amuses me was this idea that one provider was providing only ad starts. And the ad ends only came once a physical circuit board was put into some piece of broadcast automation. That was just mind-boggling for us as software engineers. So we really think that we do need SCSI-35 to be more systematically adopted, conformed to, and made robust for OTT delivery if we are going to innovate in the advertising experience. So for example, there's just no way we could ever even contemplate trying to bring some of our interactive advertising units if we can't see the boundaries. In fact, it's impossible right now for us to even insert into our local avails given how unreliable it is. For the out-of-band metadata, same story. We're just basically finding that the quality of the 224 is very, very variable. And different networks, especially the sports networks, use very different ways to convey blackouts or different blackout scenarios. So the one that gave us gave us fits towards the end was blacking out a game that was going into overtime. So if you didn't know any better, you would lift the blackout once the game ended according to the schedule. So that means we need to be informed that the game is going to be extended. And different providers do this very differently. So we basically had to scramble to find ways to fix that up. And then in general, as I mentioned, we had to spin up operations to basically do sweeps through the entire schedule to clean it up. There are like little gaps in the schedule, things coming in at weird times. A game might be presented to us as a 5-minute version of the program, then a 2-hour and 55-minute version of the program. Just weird things like that. And we're just constantly having to clean that up. And then on top of that, the 224 doesn't always give us a way to match it up with anything else. You kind of have to guess, okay, well, the length looks like it matches with the schedule. I hope and pray that it's the right thing. For us, as we were innovating in the experience, we really needed richer metadata. We had a heavy dependency on metadata. It would have been really nice to have had a free, common ID space across all different entities. Now, I know that EIDR covers some of this, but it doesn't cover all of it. I mentioned a few examples, such as the sports experience. But we also needed, the idea of one that really stood out was the lack of original air date. So if I'm trying to make the best use of my recommendation surface area and only present things to you that I know you're going to be engaged with, let's take sports for an example. Let's say you watched the Warriors game already, but it gets re-aired a couple of times after. I don't want to waste recommendation surface area presenting to you something that you've already seen, but I can't tell whether or not you've seen it because it's a re-air, and there's nothing telling me that's a re-air. And then in general, if you think about, in the internet age, in order to optimize for engagement and optimize for click-through rate, we need different ways to merchandise the content, and we need richer art in general. So for us, we found that in general, when it worked, it really, really worked. It looks beautiful, it's intriguing, you kind of get what's going on, you want to click on it. And then it sometimes just doesn't work at all. There is no art for some programs. There's no good portrait art for the NHL playoffs, for example. And then even the matchups, we had to manually generate these. Actually, we built an application and service to generate these matchup thumbnails for ourselves. Give you a quick, crazy story about sports in general. When we first started out building the prototype, we were told, you can't use the team names. That's the IP of the leagues. And it's like, oh, okay. That was pretty challenging. We obviously worked through some of these things, but there are some very interesting challenges in the sports experience. Here's a quick example of art that, it doesn't completely suck, but is still broken and slightly wrong. So most of us know what the Fast and Furious is about in general, but this image clearly doesn't convey anything about it other than it has Paul Walker. And the reason is that we literally have no other art to use here. That's 16:9, that is at 1080p, and doesn't have text already burned into the image. It's literally the only image we have. We actually have very advanced algorithms to tell us, oh, this image would be good for us or not. It has stuff on the left-hand side. It's high enough resolution. It's an interesting shot, so on and so forth. We can't use those algorithms if there's only one image that we can apply it to. So for us, art is really one of the core pieces of metadata that we would like the industry to really begin taking seriously. We live in the internet age. Everything should be tested, right? Everything should be A/B tested. I should be able to experiment with different ways to present content to you. That person may like character shots more than action shots. That person might like spaceships and vehicles and is more likely to click on them for different reasons. These are really basic things that in the internet age we should be able to apply, but we can't do it because the art simply isn't there. The reason why I care so much about this is if you think about the experience on live TV today, the way in which content discovery is kind of being driven to you is through some pretty old approaches, such as heavy use of house ads. How many times are you getting hammered with the same house ad for a show that you have no interest in? Or by aggressive use of tune-ins and applying the schedule. The schedule will work for people that are using or are still into appointment viewing, but for the on-demand customers, that's just not going to work. So we have to find different ways to merchandise the content and get people engaged with it. So in closing, how do we foster more growth and innovation based on the things that we encountered? So an old boss of mine at Xbox always said, break things down into the business experience and the technology. He said that before the internet age, so operations I added in. So I'm the tech guy, so I'm not going to opine on what has to happen on the business side to slow down the escalating economics. But the economics are getting kind of crazy, and something's going to have to change at some point. From my perspective, I feel like there are opportunities to start building options and approaches to give to the industry to think about how they can more effectively monetize their content. And by that I mean something that doesn't require hammering our consumers with ads. We all know that too many ads, it just sucks. We need more rights to unlock more innovation and experimentation. I would love to be able to experiment with creating clips from content and seeing which clips people react to. You can't do that. You run into guild issues as a consequence. I've never used the word guild issues in a sentence ever before this. But I understand why it's an issue. You don't want people going, the internet is also a big, bad, scary place. You don't want people going crazy with your content. I understand that. But we do need some way to better merchandise content. Because our goal is not to replicate broadcast TV, right? I mean, we really want to delight our viewers. And the way we delight them is by connecting them with the content they love or will love. Highly engaged users whom we can target more effectively will command higher CPMs for advertising. Higher CPMs means that we can go with a lighter ad load, which is what we have done on Hulu SVOD. And as a consequence, you get a better experience. For all of that to work, we need to know more about the content. We need basic things like SCUDdy 35 and 224 better implemented, more consistently implemented. And fundamentally, that last bullet there, we should be trying to push towards a different way of thinking about innovation here that is more aligned with where the internet has gotten to. Finally, I feel like it just has to be a little bit easier to pull all this stuff together. It has gotten extremely fragmented in the intervening years that I've last looked at this. It's extremely hard to get metadata and art. There's no way to match all this stuff together right now. Fundamentally, the way you might hate this analogy, but it's a lot like retail. If you have a killer retail product, you want that being sold everywhere. It should be, and it is trivial, or relatively trivial, to get distribution for a hot product. It is not so easy in this space right now, and we've got to find ways to make it easier. I'd like to think about a world where we present different options to the broadcast world, a world where somehow we can accomplish more dynamic, lighter ad loads. It might mean really deviating from what it means for streams to look like broadcast. You basically are going to have to think about a completely different content value chain that allows us to do more innovative things on the internet than, because right now it feels like we're pretty hamstrung by a lot of the legacy in broadcast TV. So with that, I hope we pushed everyone to think slightly differently about what the TV experience could be. We pushed hard on both the business experience and technology. As we ran into legacy systems or operational pain, we did end up having to compromise quite a bit in order to clean things up. And I really do hope that with these learnings, we can begin to find ways to unlock more innovation at internet speed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tian Lim from Hulu, CTO. We've got time for a few questions. If you have questions, just raise your hand. I see a question right over here. I'll come over with the microphone.
So it seems that you broke down the concept of broadcast channels and are doing your own curation. What kind of pushback did you get from the owners of those channels, even though they're your owners as well?
So we were very careful to negotiate, and that's what I meant by pushing on the business side. And we were negotiating with them to find ways for them to meet their branding needs as well as our needs to try and convey things the way that we think users want it. So you will notice that we are very meticulous about ensuring the proper network attribution goes to each piece of content. You will notice that there are ways to stay within a channel if that's the way you like to consume content. I think those were the major things. We have the ability, and we'll be increasing the capability for the networks to innovate in their spaces. So within each, what we call a network hub, are areas that they can editorialize, promote content, and so on and so forth. And this is something that we've actually done on Hulu SVOD already. So we understand that relationship. Another dimension of that is making sure that our recommendations, generally bias that specific channel, for example. So, it's a negotiation, but we got as far as we could.
All right, another question right here.
Can you talk a little bit about the user experience in the case of, say, a sports situation where a blackout rule is in effect? Is the user actually going to see that such an event is available, or they won't even notice that it's available if they're blacked out?
So in general, if we know about the blackout minutes in advance, we will make sure that it just doesn't show up. So you don't even know that you're missing it, typically.
Another question, raise your hand. Oh, I see it right here.
Hi, can you tell us if you're applying machine learning to your recommendations engine?
Absolutely. Our Beijing office was actually planted right on the fringes of Tsinghua University, where we were hoovering up all the machine learning graduates. So we are applying a lot of advanced techniques there.
Raise your hand nice and high if you've got a question. Okay, up in the front here.
Are there any plans for you guys to go international?
But no, there aren't right now. We're always considering it.
Anyone else? All the way on the other side, coming over. That's where I get my workout.
Tim, very innovative user experience. I'm curious what surprised you from users during your private beta. There's something that they liked that you didn't think they would like, or something they disliked?
I think that obviously the removal of the EPG is always the most jarring thing that people encounter, and there's usually often a visceral reaction to that. And then you discover the magic. I gave a few of the highlights there. And once you get that, and once the people got that, they got into a rhythm of understanding how to use the user interface in a different way. And there are many different ways to use it. In fact, I and the product team would constantly, just retro the way in which we'd been using the product recently. And then as we introduce new features, we'd retro how we were using it differently as a consequence. So there are many different ways to make good use of my stuff. We tweaked onboarding in order to ensure that the lack of an EPG was mitigated substantially by making sure that they had easy, quick access to the things that they were used to. And I think in general, those things really help balance out the lack of an EPG.
Okay, another question here.
Hi, just wondering, do you have any words on MPEG Dash and royalties and how it's affecting Hulu?
That's probably a longer conversation than here. In general, we are going to be looking towards FMP4 in general, so we'll see how that shakes out.
All right, time for maybe one or two more questions. Here you go.
So as far as value and price point, your Hulu plus Live TV is $40, and how do you compare with satellite or cable as far as your value proposition?
So, obviously we have on the order of 50 plus channels and full access to the Hulu SVOD library, and that's probably the big differentiator right there. We have more on-demand content than pretty much any DMVPD or MVPD out there. And so as a consequence, we think we have a pretty competitive price point.
All right, time. One more question, all the way there in the back. Here we go.
Thank you for your presentation. Very, very insightful. You made a comment at the end about the economics, to which I'm, when you were saying they're getting out of control, I'm assuming you're referring to the increasing operational burden of internet video. What are some of the things you guys are looking into doing to address those growing economic burdens?
So actually, I was referring to the economics on the content value chain and how the price of content seems to be just constantly going up, and that seems unsustainable. To address your specific question, we're pretty new to live streaming right now, and so we're just getting the first bills. So I will answer that question next year.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Nice big round of applause for Tian Lim.